Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. First, I'd like to thank you for attending our webinar today. Today, we have Dr. Kathleen Ferraro presenting for the Arizona Criminal Justice Commission. This webinar's presentation is called Impact on Intimate Partner Violence on Children. The webinar will be recorded and distributed next week with closed captioning. If you're having any technical issues, please use the chat pod in the lower right corner or contact us at fvi@nau.edu. If you have any questions or comments, you can use the chat pod on the right side also. This presentation will include video clips, which will be located underneath the presenter's webcam. If you're having issues with it, please state that in the chat pod, and links will be provided at the end of the session. Thank you again, and let's begin.
Thank you, Ray, and thanks everyone for signing on today to this webinar. I have a lot of information to cover today, so I'm going to jump right in, and I will make every effort to answer people's questions at the end of the presentation, and if I'm unable to answer your question, please email me and I will definitely respond to you. So here we go. There are so many threats to our children's well-being and health in the world today, and we know that domestic violence is one of the many threats that children face, but we're going to kind of focus on that issue today. Interestingly enough, if you've been in the domestic violence movement for a while, you know that children were the last group to be addressed and recognized. And one study of the research on impact of domestic violence on children found that between 1980 and 1994, there were only 19 articles published on that topic. Starting in about the mid-90s, there was an explosion of research, so there are now well over 1,000 articles addressing this issue. Just to kind of give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about today, I'll talk about what we know in terms of the prevalence of kids exposed to domestic violence and the co-occurrence of maltreatment of children in homes where parental violence is occurring. Then I want to talk about the kinds of intimate partner violence and how the type of violence that's occurring impacts children differently. I also want to look at the question of exposure versus participation and talk about the resilience of children and their participation as active agents in negotiating violence in their homes. I want to address the research on intergenerational transmission of domestic violence, then what it takes to have healthy child development, the factors that go into attachment and resilience, the way that brain science is informing our understanding of the impact of trauma, and the response of child welfare systems to the presence of domestic violence in children's homes. So as I said, the earliest research on the impact of intimate partner violence on children was really addressed to marital conflict. And that research in the 70s and 80s focused on high conflict relationships and what impact that had on kids. And what they found was that high conflict relationships where there were frequent arguments and a kind of continuous level of hostility resulted in the worst outcomes for kids. And that in many instances, post-divorce continuation of that conflict resulted in more adverse consequences for kids, including difficulties with school, behavioral problems acting out at school and at home, and depression and withdrawal from social activities. What we learned from that early research that then moved into the issue of violence in the home was that any kind of physical, psychological, or sexual harm to a parent increases risk to children in the home. The National Survey of Children's Exposure to Violence, conducted primarily by David Finkelhor in New Hampshire, has been done, I think, 3 times now. The most recent survey for 2013 and 2014 found that of the children interviewed, which were 4,000 kids, general random sample of the U.S. population, 5.8% of kids had experienced intimate partner violence in their homes in the previous years, and 15.8% had experienced intimate partner violence in their homes during their lifetime. And so the children interviewed were infants to 17, of course. For kids under 10, a parent was interviewed, and then for kids in their teens, they were interviewed directly. But looking only at kids 14 to 17, a quarter of those youth had been exposed to intimate partner violence in their homes. So this was a slight, non-significant decrease from the previous survey in 2011, but still a significant portion, about a quarter of teenagers randomly selected from the U.S. population report having experienced intimate partner violence within their homes, which translates to about 8 million kids a year and 18.5 million over their lifetime. When we look at agency samples as opposed to random samples of the population, of course the rates are much higher. About a third, 29% of kids involved in child welfare report having domestic violence in their home in the previous year. Studies of police response to intimate partner violence report that about half of them have children present at the time of police intervention, and that includes the most serious forms of domestic violence, homicide and near homicide. Rhode Island Department of Public Health survey of domestic violence found that in 44% of cases, kids were present at the time of the violence. And the highest proportion of children witnessing domestic violence is with samples drawn from domestic violence shelters. So when we talk about children's exposure or experience of intimate partner violence, there's different ways that kids experience it. Of course, they can directly witness the violence, but they can also hear from the other room what's going on. And in those instances, often imagining what kinds of events are taking place in the other room. They can know about it by seeing the injuries on a parent. They can witness arrest of one or both of their parents. Someone in the family or outside the family may inform them about the violence. And they also may experience coercive control, which I'll talk about further in a moment, that affects everyone in the household. So, and it's important that when we talk about or even think about the ways that children are affected by intimate partner violence, that we specify what form they're experiencing this violence. So the national survey did ask what kind of exposure kids had, and this is from the 2011 study. I haven't found the publication of these data for the more recent 2013-14 study. But of course, the most severe forms of assault are the least frequent, with only about 1.3% witnessing that in the past year and 5.3% over the lifetime. But of any exposure in that time period, it was almost 18% and 6.6% over the past year. So as the level of severity increases, the proportion of children who report experiencing that in their homes decreases. And it's important to keep that in mind, because when we talk about children's exposure to intimate partner violence, there's a tendency to kind of lump intimate partner violence together in one unitary phenomenon, which just contradicts what we know about intimate partner violence. In Finkelhorst's study, the vast majority of kids were actually eyewitnesses. 90% of them had witnessed it firsthand, seen it. They also were involved in responding to that violence. About half of the kids said that they yelled at their parents to stop. 44% tried to get away, and 24%, almost a quarter of the kids did call someone to help to intervene in the situation. So these data gonna go to my point that I'll elaborate on in a moment about that children are not simply exposed as they'd be exposed to a toxic material. They're actually participants and actively strategize to resist violence within their homes. As is consistent with our data about intimate partner violence overall, the perpetrators of violence in front of children are primarily males, mostly fathers, but also boyfriends or other males within the household. 12% of it was perpetrated by mothers, and then another 7% by other women. So the gender breakdown is primarily 70% men only, 22% females only, and then 9% both male and female in the household. And this is pretty consistent with our data about perpetration of intimate partner violence in terms of the gender breakdown. It's important to note that even though men are the largest group of perpetrators, that there's still a significant proportion of intimate partner violence that's perpetrated by females. And the research on the impact on children has focused really heavily only on that which is perpetrated by males, and we definitely need more research on female perpetrated intimate partner violence and its impact on kids. We do know that kids who are experience intimate partner violence in their homes are also at higher risk for other forms of victimization, that is violence outside of the home, witnessing violence outside of the home, and of course their own abuse within the home. We have a concern that whenever there's violence against a parent, that there's also violence occurring against children. And from Finkelhor's research, he found that about a third, 34%, of children who witnessed partner violence were also maltreated directly themselves in the previous year, and 57%, over half of them, were maltreated over the lifetime. And 3/4 of kids who are experiencing custodial interference also experience witnessing parental violence. So this also supports what we know of, that domestic violence doesn't end when a victim leaves the relationship. It can continue on in effects on the kids after leaving the relationship. So there's really been some great research in Europe and in Canada that encourages us to think about kids not only as witnesses to domestic violence and as damaged by domestic violence, but it's also as direct victims and active participants in meaning making. And I don't mean direct victims in the sense of also being abused, but direct victims in the sense that witnessing parental violence is harmful to kids, so they are a direct victim. But they also actively participate in meaning making within their families. They are resistant, they are resilient, and they find ways to protect the abused parent, themselves, their siblings. And the research talking to children about these experiences finds that that protective role actually provides a sense of pride and meaning that they're able to do something to help the people within their family. And so the scholars talk about this in terms of normative childhood and paradoxical resistance. By normative childhood, we mean the expectation that children are innocent and incapable of protecting themselves, that it's the job of the adults in the family to protect them, which of course is true. At the same time, children are able to participate in ways that assist victims in their family and support their own survival, and that kids continuously craft strategies for managing the violence in their home. And they also express that when they talk about these strategies and how they make sense of violence in their homes, they feel that service providers are not really hearing them and not really taking their experiences and their perspectives into account in their crafting of responses. So children use their strengths in order to survive and make sense of the violence in their homes. They use physical objects, toys, stuffed animals, build forts. They build hideouts where they can hide with their brothers and sisters. They reenact violence through their play to make sense of it. And they comfort themselves and others in their homes. They found that working together as a team enhances sibling relationships at times in violent homes, and that kids that enter refuge and are able to talk to other children who've been through the same circumstances value that experience greatly because they do have a sense in other environments of stigma, and that other kids will make fun of them and bully them if they don't also have that experience of violence in their homes. And in the next webinar in this series, our colleague Melissa Rhodes is going to talk about the importance of peer groups for kids who experience parental homicide, because these kids have a very different experience than children who suffer other forms of trauma in their lives. Research in Canada has talked to children about their relationships with their abused mothers. And over again, children express the importance of that relationship, as well as the difficulties that violence brings into the relationships with their mothers. So kids talk about the vital link to their moms. It's their identity. It's my mom keeps my heart pumping. But at the same time, feeling that the violence kind of leaves her with little time and little energy to address the children's needs. And another thing kids talked about was kind of the distance resulting from wanting their moms to leave the abuser, talking to them about it, and the mother not leaving, and this building some estrangement into the relationship. But that once they're out of that violent relationship and in a safe spot, kids report feeling much closer and happier and being able to have time to enjoy life in their family instead of continuously being wary, scared, and depressed and worried about their mom and their own safety. I'm going to talk about the intergenerational transmission of violence in a minute. But I want to talk briefly about Megan Hasselschwert's work with Young Adults Live and Learn project, because what she found in talking to young adults about their experiences with parental violence within the home was that they didn't want to replicate that. So I often hear people saying if kids see violence in the home, they're going to grow up to be victims or perpetrators because of the cycle of violence. And what she's found is a little bit different than that. Of course, these are young people talking about their aspirations, but they express their sense of having higher expectations and being aware of any signal that could predict violence in a relationship, and saying, I don't want to end up in that situation. So rather than feeling that domestic violence was normal, and accepting it, they expressed at least their perception that they were going to be more choosy, more cautious, and more aware of signals that could predict violence in the relationship. So I hope people are now able to see the slides, and I think Ray's addressed that okay. So as I started out mentioning, we often talk about intimate partner violence as one unitary phenomenon, and particularly when we're talking about intergenerational transmission or the impact of violence on kids. And that approach really disguises important distinctions in the ways intimate partner violence occurs and the types of intimate partner violence that we see. So there are several typologies out there, and the typologies are kind of gradually affecting the research on this topic. The table that I have up is Michael Johnson's typology of situational couple violence, coercive controlling violence, which he used to call intimate partner terrorism, mutual violent control, and violent resistance. What we see in general social surveys of random sections of the population is principally situational couple violence. And what we see in clinical samples is principally coercive controlling violence. And so I think a lot of practitioners working in this field are seeing, mostly will see coercive controlling violence, and I've even had people tell me that situational couple violence isn't domestic violence, but in terms of violence and criminal behavior, it is, and whether or not it's situational or coercive controlling violence makes a huge difference in how children experience the violence and the effects it has on them. So situational couple violence is when a particular conflict escalates and reaches the point of violence. So it's not a pattern of control and domination that we often associate with intimate partner violence. Men and women perpetrate situational couple violence at fairly equal rates. This is pretty well established now by general social surveys. Even though men's situational couple violence is more likely to injure and cause negative consequences to victims. But the gender symmetry, gender asymmetry argument about whether men or women are more violent in relationships is often addressed by looking at what kind of violence we're talking about, because if we're talking about violence that occurs within the limited context of a conflict that escalates, then there appears to be fairly symmetrical perpetration rates between men and women. But when we talk about coercive control, it's another story. Situational couple violence can also be quite serious. It can involve serious injury. And it can be caused by a number of different factors: substance abuse, communication issues. We often say domestic violence is not caused by anger, but we do know that anger is present often in situational couple violence. Anger is a normal human emotion. It doesn't need to lead to violence, but it's often present. So in terms of what we see in general social surveys, this is the most common type. And when we say 3 out of all women, 3 out of 30% of all women will experience intimate partner violence, a lot of what we are talking about is situational couple violence. But when we are working with clinical populations, social service populations, a lot of what we're seeing is coercive controlling violence, or what Johnson used to call intimate terrorism. And in these relationships, there's not just a single incident that's a result of conflict, but a pattern of violent and coercive control involving multiple tactics. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the power and control wheel that describes all of the tactics that abusers use apart from violence to dominate and control their partner. And of course, these tactics vary from case to case, but they involve different combinations of isolating the partner from their friends and family and all social contacts, emotional abuse, intimidation, using the children, and other tactics of control. So obviously, if there's an overarching atmosphere of coercive control in the home, that's going to have a very different effect on kids than if there's an argument that escalates to violence, even if children witness that, which of course is not a good thing. But it's going to have a much more limited effect than an ongoing pattern of coercive control. I'm going to kind of skip over these quickly because there's not as much research on these, and they're less common. Violent resistance is when a victim fights back. They use violence in a response to their own abuse, and that can range from a slap to homicide. It's not the same as bidirectional violence. It's when an abused person strikes back and uses violence either in direct self-protection or as a result of a level of frustration and fear. And it's primarily a female response. And the fourth category is mutual violent control. This is when both people are attempting to coercively control their partner through nonviolent and violent strategies. It's the most unusual, and we have very little research data on this form of control. But as you can imagine, if both parents are engaged in this type of behavior, the atmosphere in the household is going to be quite negative for children, in addition to the violence that occurs. So one of the kind of ground truths, I think, in the field of domestic violence is the cycle of violence, or the intergenerational transmission of abuse. Research on people's perceptions of the cycle of violence is that it's very well accepted that if a child experiences violence in their home, they will become juvenile delinquents, they will become criminal offenders, they will become perpetrators of violence as adults. And there's kind of different forms of this cycle of violence. There's a kind of generalized form, and this is from Megan Hasselschwartz's work as well. General exposure that leads to victimization or perpetration or both during adolescence and adulthood. And then there's the more specific linkage between the exposure to parental intimate partner violence, then perpetration and victimization of dating violence as adolescents, and then intimate partner violence in adulthood, kind of the different models. And of course, they're all based on Bandura's social learning theory that what children witness within their homes, they learn and will model in their adult relationships. Postmus and Merritt interviewed 64 child protective service workers and found that 98% of them strongly agreed with the cycle of violence. And they argued that there's overwhelming support in the provider community for the cycle. So certainly people see this in their work, that they witness that kids who have problems as juveniles with violence and criminal behavior have come from homes where there is violence, and that adult perpetrators came from homes where there was violence. But when we look at the research literature, there are major problems with trying to document the existence of that cycle. For one thing, we often rely on retrospective accounts from adults about what their experiences were as children, or we rely on third-party accounts, often mothers of children, for describing the levels of violence in their childhood. And typically, a lot of research doesn't specify the nature or the severity of abuse. It's a dichotomy. Either there was abuse or there wasn't abuse. And as I was just trying to explain, there's a lot of variation in the kinds of abuse that can take place within a household between parents. And the nature of that abuse really influences the impact on kids. A lot of the research doesn't specify whether children observed the abuse or were direct child abuse victims, or were both, and obviously that will have a different impact. Importantly, a lot of research does not control for other factors that are correlated with violent behavior, such as substance abuse, kinds of certain forms of mental disorders, and high rates of poverty. And then a lot of the research also will report a very small effect size as proof of a causal relationship. That is, that they find a correlation of a small magnitude and then interpret that as a direct causal relationship, that the violence in childhood leads to the violence in adulthood. So Sandra Stith did a meta-analysis of research on the intergenerational transmission And she only included studies that had some statistical analysis of the effect of the presence of childhood exposure to intimate partner violence and adult perpetration. She looked at 34 studies, and she compared studies that looked at agency samples and community samples. And when she looked at only community general survey samples, there was a very small effect for people witnessing intimate partner violence as children and then perpetrating it as adults. The effect size is larger for men than it is for women, and it's much larger for agency samples, which that is the most consistent finding among all the studies, is that among agency samples of men, those who witnessed interparental violence as children were significantly more likely to perpetrate violence as adults. However, in terms of a causal relationship, meta-analyses all the research finds that there is little direct causal relationship between witnessing parental intimate partner violence and either perpetrating it or being victimized by it as adults. Because just because two variables are correlated does not mean that one causes the other. And the kind of intimate partner violence, again, this is a theme song for me, really matters. So that men who witnessed intimate partner violence in their homes were 7 times more likely to be intimate partner terrorists or coercively controlling intimate partner perpetrators as were men who did not. So it contributes not just to violence, but also to behavior that we would classify as coercively controlling. If kids are exposed to both child maltreatment and parental intimate partner violence, that will increase negative outcomes. So it's a double whammy. Both the direct victimization and the witnessing of parental violence increases negative outcomes. And the more frequent and the more severe the violence, the more negative outcomes and the more abusers within their homes. So if there are multiple stepfathers or there are additional males within the household, uncles, cousins, who are also violent, that will also contribute to the problems that children encounter as a result of being exposed. The term polyvictimization just refers to multiple forms of victimization, and kids who have not only exposure to intimate partner violence but also other forms of victimization have higher scores on trauma symptoms. And this is also from David Finkelhor's research. And of kids that have 11 or more forms of victimization in their lives, 87.5% of them also witnessed family violence. And children with polyvictimization have trauma scores 3 times higher than kids who are only exposed to parental violence. And so what Finkelhor argues is that when we're seeing negative outcomes as a consequence of exposure to parental violence, that may be due more to the underlying influence of polyvictimization, multiple forms of victimization, rather than the direct outcome of exposure to parental violence. So what kind of problems do we see that kids have? What are these negative outcomes? They're generally categorized into both internalizing and externalizing consequences. For kids that internalize this trauma, we see a lot of withdrawal from social relationships, depression, sometimes clinical levels of depression and anxiety, somatic complaints, so a lot of headaches, stomach aches, missing school because they don't feel good at all. They have higher scores on post-traumatic stress symptoms, and we see these symptoms increasing with age. So the older the kids are, the more likely we'll see these trauma symptoms. And originally the research reported that girls are more likely to suffer from internalizing negative outcomes than boys, but the more current research finds there's a pretty gender equal ratio of internalizing and externalizing problems as a result of trauma. The externalizing consequences are aggression and hostility, generalized hostility towards others, towards teachers, other kids, sometimes towards the abused parent, higher rates of substance abuse, and bullying of other kids. And there is also slightly higher impact in terms of observing externalizing behaviors with boys, but we do see frequently with girls too. And of course, all of these consequences are affected by kids' age and by many other factors in their lives besides their gender. Also see some cognitive consequences, lower academic functioning in kids who are exposed to domestic violence. Again, it's difficult to draw conclusions because a lot of the research doesn't specify the nature of the violence that kids are experiencing. But in households where there's chronic levels of coercive control and high levels of conflict occurring, it's going to be much more difficult for kids to find mental space to concentrate and be enthusiastic about learning. At the extreme level of the impact of intimate partner violence are child fatalities that are linked to the abuse of a mother. And the mother's own polyvictimization. So over the years, I've worked with a number of women who've been prosecuted when their male partners killed their children. And consistent themes emerging in those circumstances are that the male partner feels that, or informs her that she's not disciplining the child correctly, and that if she doesn't do so, that he'll leave her. And so often these are not the biological fathers of the children, and they have a high level of hostility toward the kids while they're abusing the mother. But in addition to the domestic violence, there's also typically a lot of other problems occurring with the household, high levels of trauma for both caregivers, the mother and the male partner, substance abuse, high levels of substance abuse, extreme poverty. Often there's a new pregnancy with a new partner. There are mental health problems and low intellectual functioning. And the photos on the left are photos of a home where a little girl was killed, 3-year-old child, with the board shown below while they were living in this small shack. And Child Protective Services had removed 11 children from the home, but 2 were returned, and the one child was killed within a couple months of being returned there. So domestic violence, intimate partner violence, was certainly one component of the constellation of factors that led to this tragedy, but there were also multiple other levels of problems occurring that we see typically when fatalities occur. It's not only the domestic violence. The other trauma that kids suffer in situations of intimate partner violence in their homes is when one parent is killed or nearly killed, or when one parent is killed and the other commits suicide. And Melissa Rhodes, the next webinar, is going to go into a lot of detail about this and discuss the ACASI project we have here at the Family Violence Institute, working with kids who are survivors of parental homicide. But the limited research that exists shows that often children are present when these homicides occur. They may be the person who finds the body, and that the resources addressing this particular form of complex trauma are quite limited, and we're only beginning to address the complex trauma of parental homicide. It's particularly egregious when both parents are lost, either to suicide, homicide, suicide, or to incarceration. And the limited research talking to kids who've survived this talk about how really they have lost everything, and they have really unique needs for intervention. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that topic because Melissa's entire webinar will address parental homicide. So I'm sure everyone's familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or the ACEs study. And as you know, the initial research did ask about whether or not the mother was abused within the home. And the more recent iterations of the ACEs study ask about parental violence. Does one parent use violence against the other parent? What we learned from the ACEs research is that there's a 95% probability that children experiencing intimate partner violence in their home will also experience at least one other adverse childhood experience. And about 36% of children who were exposed to intimate partner violence in their homes had 4 or more other adverse experiences. And so what we know from the ACEs research is that it's not just the emotional impact of having violence in the home. There are also long-term health consequences for children, including a higher rates of diabetes, heart disease, obesity, and hypertension. As I mentioned, poorer academic achievement, problems with social relationships, higher rates of behavioral disorders and substance abuse, and emotional impact as well. But we also know that many children do not show harmful effects of adverse experiences during childhood, and that 37%, over a third of kids who are exposed to domestic violence, do not show the negative effects of that exposure, and that children vary hugely in their responses to all kinds of trauma, but and specifically to intimate partner violence, and that children can rebound from traumatic stress. And so that in providing trauma-informed care, we need to be aware of children's strengths and their capacity for resilience. ACEs are normal. All of us experience an adverse experience while growing up. At least most of us do. And it's the response of the parents as well as the community at large and children's own resources that will shape the outcome of those adverse experiences. So in addition to talking about polyvictimization, we can also now talk about polystrengths. And there are 3 main domains in portfolios of resilience, and this is drawn from Sherry Hamby's research, who's also a co-author with Finkelhor of the exposure to violence research. And these 3 domains are self-regulation, the ability to control impulses and manage difficult emotions and persevere in the face of setbacks, interpersonal relationships, having social relationships and qualities that sustain them in their culture and in their context, in their social context, and meaning making, the ability to explain and understand experiences. Some forms of trauma are so overwhelming that people need a lot of support in making sense of it. And of course, having some sense of purpose and hope, either through organized religion or spirituality, other philosophies which help people understand and make meaning of their experiences, both of trauma and of positive. The total number of protective factors that people possess contributes to resilience. And so studies of people that have high levels of difficulties in their lives show that the density of strengths can result in high levels of subjective well-being and growth and mental health. But these networks of protective factors are not only intrapersonal, that is what an individual brings to their experience, but intrapersonal. What resources does the community provide? what do people in their lives provide in terms of support for dealing with trauma. So what kids need, I think most people know that kids need love, and they need consistency and safety, in addition to the physical needs of good nutrition and exercise. They also need respect and supported autonomy. So how does, of course, it varies across stages, from infants that need a tremendous amount of caregiving to adolescents that need your attention and respect and support, but they also need autonomy. So how does intimate partner violence interfere with those needs of children? Often either the one or both of the parents are just unavailable to the kids. The abused parent is struggling to keep herself safe and to deal with the demands of the abusive partner, to the point that they may not have much emotional availability or even physical ability to care for their kids. The children are primarily concerned with minimizing the stress and the anger in the household, so they will withdraw from activities. They will not have other friends over, which contributes to their isolation, both with other kids and supportive adults. The stress interferes with their ability to have normal eating, sleeping patterns, and just playing, which is a central activity for normal child development. And we're also learning through recent advances in neurological research how trauma impacts the brain, which I'll turn to shortly, and that the maternal attachment is inhibited. Often the abusive parent will interfere with that maternal bonding process by making excessive demands, being jealous, and actually even using children in the abuse process to say horrible things about the mother and to force the mother to not tend to the needs of the child. So what kids express about their experiences are that they're afraid, they're angry, they're lonely and sad, and they have divided loyalties. We know this in terms of the research on divorce. Kids love both their parents, and it's particularly difficult for kids when one parent is abusing the other, because children want approval and connection with both of their parents. And so having one parent be an abuser and the other abused really makes it difficult for kids to sort out their loyalties and their feelings. They feel protective, and they also feel helpless to stop and change the situation. And at this point, I want to play a short video that actually is children's voices, a break from my voice, and listen to what children have to say about their experiences.
I was 14. My stepdad hit my mom, and he hit me. My mom handed me the phone and told me to call the police. We went to Anselma House. Then my mom got mad at me and said we could have figured it out on our own. That's the first time I went to a shelter.
My dad pushed my mom, and he said the F word, the A word, and the S word. It made me sad and mad and very, very scared.
My dad was pushing my mom halfway over the balcony. There was cement on the bottom.
Mom called the police on him because he kept screaming at her, calling her bad names.
This is everybody yelling to my mom. She used to be friends with my dad, but not anymore because he hit her.
Our dads and moms are like being like
Scary daddy monster.
being like pokers. He was drinking too much. He was smashing things.
When I was a baby, my mommy and daddy broke up 4 times.
This is how you might feel when your parents are fighting. Uncomfortable, mad, sad, scared. run away.
I feel mad, and sometimes I feel lonely. I'm the girl with red hair. And I'm crying because I think my mom's gonna get hurt.
When I was younger, I tried to get in between them, tried to get them to see the logic. I had courage back then. I thought, if I could just fix it. When I got older, I gave up and didn't clean up their mess, just played video games and read books.
Sometimes we climb on top of the couch and we yell, 1, 2, 3, shut up! Sometimes I cover my ears like this. It didn't work. So
Yeah, I plugged my ears too.
So I tried to stop them.
I usually just went outside to play. Some kids in my neighborhood started bugging me. And I'm like, just leave me alone. I just wanted to run away, run with my friends. Just run. We had to go to the park. And then we had to stay with my mom's friend. I was worried about my mom. Maybe she would get a black eye. It happened before.
If I go into my brother's or sister's room, I don't really hear the fighting. When I was scared, I went somewhere to hide, somewhere safe.
The garden was my safe place. No one would bring an argument outside because of the neighbors. So I stayed outside a lot.
This is Chasey, my dog. I miss Chasey.
We went, on the weekend to our dad's. My dog was jumping on me. Because every night he was looking in every room, trying to find us.
I wish my mom would find a true love. But she thinks she's too old and stuck.
Maybe I could, maybe I could make them be together. Maybe I could set them up something for them, like punch and stuff, and they might get back together again, I think.
I was really happy at the shelter. The staff were awesome. I went from being this person who was worried about everything, and, well, you saved me.
Okay, sorry for the pause. It just takes a second to get my mic back on again. That video is particularly poignant for me because I started learning the violin when I was 59, and it about drove my husband crazy. So I know what it takes in a household to support kids learning new activities, and in a household where there's a demand for obedience and silence, kids can't pursue those interests in the way we would hope that they'd be able to. It's interesting for me, too, to hear kids talk about the things they want to do to keep their parents together and to heal the relationship. That kids do have this sense that if they could just do something, make some punch, have a party, that everything would be okay again. It reminds us of the perspective of kids on their parents' lives and how confusing it is when they can't help and when they do feel helpless in those situations. So we know that it is not great for kids to be in an environment of intimate partner violence, but we also know that the best protection from the harms of that exposure is a strong bond with the non-abusing parent. So the more we can support that, and I've used the term mother-child dyad again because the focus of the research is on male abusers and we have almost no research on abused fathers. But support for that non-abusing parent and the child dyad, and family and community engagement with the family. It also depends on the child's own cognitive and emotional abilities, which we can support as practitioners, and the mother's mental health. So if she's struggling with other forms of mental health besides being a victim of intimate partner violence, some direct support for the mother will also contribute to the child's well-being. Now, we know from recent neurological research about the effects of trauma on the brain and how important the first 3 years of life are for developing healthy and well-functioning brain architecture. And the Harvard Center for the Developing Child has done a lot of interesting research, and it's a great resource. The link to it is, that website is at the end of my presentation. I'm also going to show a few clips from the Harvard Center. But one of the points they emphasize in their work is that the old idea that our genetic structure determines our personality and our cognitive abilities and our success as human beings has really been replaced by epigenetics, which is the way that the environment interacts with our genetic structure to decide which genes are turned off and on as our neural connections are created within the brain. And the first 3 years are central to that process. And what's most important for healthy brain development is that children have a caring adult. Doesn't have to be a biological caregiver, as long as it's a healthy, responsive person who participates in the serve and return behavior that generates the brain circuitry in the young child. And this is just about a 2-minute clip I want to show that explains.
The key to forming strong brain architecture is what's known as serve and return interaction with adults. In this developmental game, new neural connections form in the brain as young children instinctively serve through babbling, facial expressions, and gestures. And adults return the serve, responding in a very directed, meaningful way. It starts very early in life, when a baby coos and the adult interacts and directs the baby's attention to a face or hand. This interaction forms the foundation of brain architecture upon which all future development will be built. It helps create neural connections between all the different areas of the brain, building the emotional and cognitive skills children need in life. For example, here's how it works for literacy and language skills. When the baby sees an object, the adult says its name. This makes connections in the baby's brain between particular sounds and their corresponding objects. Later, adults show young children that those objects and sounds can also be represented by marks on a page.
There we go. So that's what healthy child development consists of. And what happens when there's an interference with that process is known as toxic stress. And the child's developing brain is unable to create the neural connections that lead to a healthy brain architecture, particularly in the areas of memory and learning that are required for success in school and then throughout life. So we know that while that serve and return behavior creates the neural structure for healthy development, we also know that toxic stress will derail that process and interfere with the creation of a healthy brain structure. So this little clip shows what happens within the brain when
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
There we go. So these are images from two child's brains. The one on the left that's very colorful and well developed is of a healthy brain where there's a lot of activity and a lot of neural connections have been made, and in the area of fully functioning brain structure. This brain on the left-hand side is healthy. The one on the right-hand side is a brain of a Romanian orphan who was institutionalized right after birth, and you're probably familiar with the research on the Romanian orphans that were left in their cribs unattended for days at a time. And the consequence of that is that the brain does not develop normally, that the temporal lobes, which regulate emotion, are lacking in neural development. And so that's what they're referring to in terms of the lifelong consequences of this toxic stress, is those important centers of regulation, emotion regulation, are lacking. And the period from 1 to 3, when they're most active in creating brain architecture, is when they're most seriously affected by toxic stress. But we know, just like ACEs are not destiny, toxic stress is not destiny. There is the possibility of rebuilding those neural connections and patterns of positive adaptation, even in the face of significant adversity. And as I started out the presentation saying, there's a lot of different ways that trauma can affect brain structure besides intimate partner violence. And yet, and they may have nothing to do with the family structure, for example, the horrible storms that are affecting many places in the world today. So if there is an emotionally attuned adult, again, that doesn't have to be the biological parent. It can be someone else in the family. It can be a caregiver. It can even be a neighbor, someone who has routine and a dependable relationship with the child. that can provide the stimulation and activity that the child needs to form those neural connections. Of course, it also depends on healthy nutrition and environments. But even more important than that are those emotional connections that are secure and dependable for the child. Now, recent research has shown, in fact, this report just came out in March, that neurogenic activity, or the building of neural connections, continues throughout life. We really don't stop building neural connections. And that's good news for us older folks. You're not too old to learn something new. But the best time for building those connections is the first few years of life. And you can see in this diagram from the Center on the Developing Child, the brain's ability to change in response to experiences. So the plasticity of the brain and how much effort it requires. So up at the far left-hand corner, you see that the brain changes very easily and quickly up until about the age of 10, and then it starts to decline. Although there's another growth period in the adolescent years where there's also a lot of activity that's affected by hormonal changes. But the effort to make change just increases and significantly after 50. I guess the chart stops at 70 for some reason, because I think we continue to learn after that point as well. But the effort required for change increases dramatically. So that's why the effect of intimate partner violence on children is going to vary depending on their age, and up until age 10 is going to have the most impact on the brain's development and the consequences for the growth of neural connections in that growth period, and then decline, of course, throughout life. So brain structure, interaction with a caring adult is one factor that influences the outcomes for children who experience intimate partner violence. But there are also community factors. The community plays a huge role in how children respond to intimate partner violence. And we can have communities that nurture resilience and that portfolio of resilience, or we can have communities that don't pay much attention to resilience factors and deal only with the negative outcomes, high levels of crime, high levels of substance abuse. In terms of where the U.S. ranks internationally for our support of children, we're 30th out of 41 developed countries for child poverty. About 20% of children in the United States live in poverty, and that rate varies dramatically by race ethnicity, from a low of 5% among white non-Hispanic children to a high of 30% among African American children. Children living in poverty can thrive in a context of very caring adults, but that support and that ability to thrive is undermined by high levels of poverty. Our educational levels are not on par with other developed countries. We have over 12% of 15-year-olds reading on a level below level 2, and also below level 2 on math and science. Over a quarter of American children report at least one health problem every day, and the U.S. ranks number 21 out of 41 developed countries in terms of children's life satisfaction. So there's a lot the community can do to support resilience in kids, and we're not living up to what we could potentially provide for that support. So one of the reasons I want to emphasize that not all children exposed to intimate partner violence have negative consequences is that when we first started recognizing the impact of intimate partner violence on children, we kind of went overboard in trying to ensure that children were protected from those negative effects. And so as a consequence, there was kind kind of a rush to remove children from homes where domestic violence was occurring. And in 2001, there was a class action suit brought in New York, Nicholson v. Williams, that sued the Child Protective Services for removing kids from homes where mothers were abused solely on the basis of the mother's abuse. And in the Nicholson case in particular, she had separated from her abuser, and she was no longer living with them, but the kids were removed, and it took her months to get them back again. And the district court ruled, Jack Weinstein, ruled that removal was unnecessary and cruel, and that Child Protective Services should not remove children from homes strictly on the grounds that there's domestic violence occurring there. Rather, they should try to provide the kind of support that's necessary to nurture that dyad between the children, and the non-abused parent. The National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges sponsored the Green Book Initiative in the late 1990s, and the late Susan Schechter and Professor Jeffrey Edelson were authors of the Green Book Initiative. And it still provides very excellent guidance for ways that family courts can support children's resilience in the face of intimate partner violence, and urges the courts to try, and the child welfare system, to try to keep children in the custody of the non-offending parent and to provide support for that relationship. And I provided links at the end of the presentation to the Green Book Initiative and to the training by Dr. Edelson on that initiative. Many states now include recognition of the impact of domestic violence on children. 8 states mention it in the child abuse statutes. 5 states define it as a separate criminal act to expose children to domestic violence. And 18 states, including my state, Arizona, have statutory provisions prescribing how Child Protective Services should deal with the co-occurrence of domestic violence and child maltreatment. And we also, 10 states also have mandatory training on domestic violence for child welfare workers. So it certainly is a complex and difficult situation, because those who are mandated to protect kids also have to consider abused parent and what is in the best interest of children and what is in the best interest of that family. And I wanted to kind of wrap it here with a picture of Virginia Clinton Kelly, whose first husband was killed in a car accident 3 months before her first child was born, and when she married a man who was alcoholic and abusive to her and to her sons, and she died just before her firstborn became 42nd President of the United States, President Bill Clinton. And I'd like to conclude with that, not because of a particular fan, you don't have to be a fan of Bill Clinton, but to become President of the United States, I think everyone would recognize as quite an achievement, and signifies the resilience of children who are provided with appropriate resources and nurturing to thrive despite their exposure to intimate partner violence. And then finally, there are resources here and links to a lot of the materials I've discussed today, and a lovely picture. I think that art is a tremendous resource for children who experience any form of trauma. And this is a picture from a little girl who entered a shelter and escaped the violence she was experiencing. It's always sunny in her picture. So I will now take any questions that have come up during the course of the discussion. If you have other things you want to raise or discuss or like me to talk about, unfortunately we don't have the ability to hear your voices, which I wish we did. But I can at least respond to the questions that you've typed into the chat box, and if there's other things you'd like me to address, please type them in the chat box. So what is custodial interference? So when someone is awarded custody of a child and then the other parent interferes with that by not returning the child on time or by taking the child away without the other parent's consent or knowledge, so interfering with the custody arrangements that are prescribed by the family court would be custodial interference. And naturally that has a negative impact on children because typically the custody arrangements are designed to provide as much structure and routine as possible, and when those routines are undermined, then that destabilizes the environment and makes the child less secure in their relationships. Then another person had asked about children's immediate responses to violence and how many kids actually physically try to intervene versus just yelling. And you know, I'm not familiar with the percentages on that. I think it's an excellent question because obviously that puts children at increased risk of physical harm to try to intervene. And in the qualitative studies that I referred to in terms of trying to find out what kids' perspectives are on intimate partner violence, children do talk about jumping in the middle, jumping on their father's back, trying to get them away from the mother. But in terms of the numbers, which is a very good question to ask, I'm sorry, but I don't, I'm not familiar. Maybe someone else on the webinar knows those numbers, but I don't. And if you send me an email, I'll do some further research after the webinar and see if I can find out an answer to that question. So we have just a comment, learn about social services negatively impacting when mandatory reporting. And I just think that the CPS workers are in a difficult situation. As I showed the photo of the shack where the child was living before she was killed, you know, that child had not been recommended for removal. They'd been reunited with a parent who had already had 11 relationships severed. 11 children were removed permanently from her custody. So you see the tragedies that can occur, and it's terrifying to think of leaving a child in a situation like that. At the same time, we also know that it's also painful for a kid to get removed from their home. And women who are in violent situations are sometimes afraid to even reach out for help because they're concerned that it might affect the custody of their that they held over their child. So it's a very there's not an easy solution to it. I'm just concerned if there's a overreaction on the side of thinking that intimate partner violence is the worst thing that the child can experience, because again, it depends upon a lot of other variables. And in most cases, the best thing that can happen is just support for that non-abusive parent. So I'm pleased that we ended early. I thought there might be a little bit more discussion, but seeing no other questions, I think we'll wrap it up now. And if you have other things that come into mind afterwards or things that I didn't address fully, please feel free to email me and I'll respond to you